The palace of Ondrin slept the way only a great house sleeps. Every hearth banked to embers, every corridor drowned in a dark so thick it seemed to breathe. Nothing stirred on the servants' stair. Nothing stirred in a long gallery where the dead kings hung in their frames. And then, at the last stroke of the 12th bell, something did. The maid was leaving again. Vielric had told no one that he watched for her. He stood in the shadow of the gallery arch with one shoulder set against the cold stone, and let the dark cover him, the way it covered everything else at this hour. Below, across the empty courtyard, a small figure crossed the frost in a servant's grey cloak, neither hurrying nor slowing, as if the middle of the night were only the place where her work happened to take her. She carried no lamp. That had been the first thing he noticed, weeks ago now, when the sickness had begun waking him before. The bells. A servant, with honest business, did not cross a king's grounds in the black, without a light. A servant with something to hide might. Her name was Leora. He had come by it carefully, because a king who asks after one particular maid sets 100 tongues wondering, and he could not afford the wondering. She turned down the beds in the royal wing. She carried linen and kindling and pails of ash like any of the others, and she kept her gaze lowered like any of the others, and not one soul in the household would have picked her face out of a crowd if you pressed them. She was the kind of quiet the eye slid off and forgot. He had begun to suspect the quiet was a thing she wore on purpose, the way another woman might wear a veil. He should have been asleep. He should have been a great many things. Instead, he was here, gaunt in a robe that hung looser on him every week, watching a servant vanish through the north door, because he had learned something this last month that he had not told his healers, or his council, or the friend who had bled beside him in 3 border wars. He was dying, and no one could tell him of what. It had come on him slowly, the way frost comes, so gradual that by the time you feel the cold, it is already in your bones. First, the tiredness. Then the mornings when his wolf would not rise to him at all, when he reached for that old second heartbeat inside his chest and found only a faint and shrinking warmth, like a coal kicked to the edge of a fire. His grip had weakened. A gray thread had come into the skin at his wrist, thin as a hair, and then another beside it, and the court physicians had pressed and peered and murmured and named it nothing, because it was nothing any of them had ever seen. And Alpha King did not sicken. That was the first law of the blood. The strongest wolf in the realm did not simply fade at the height of his years, while the whole of Talvain watched and pretended not to notice. And yet, he had made his peace, in the grim way a soldier makes peace, with not knowing how the end would come for him. What he had not made peace with was the other thing. The thing that had no place in any of it. His pain eased when the maid was near. He had not believed it at first. He had thought it a fever's trick, the mind grasping at patterns in its own suffering, but he had watched it too many times now to call it chance. On the evenings she came to tend his rooms. The gray ache that lived beneath his ribs loosened its hand. His wolf lifted its head. He slept, when she had been there, in a way he slept no other night. And then, always, at the stroke of 12, she left the palace by the north door and walked out into the cold, and within the hour the ache returned with its claws sharpened. Worse for the mercy that had gone before it. A wiser man might have called it a blessing, and asked nothing. Vielric had stopped being able to afford wisdom. He was a king with a dwindling number of nights left in him, and every one of those nights seemed to turn on the movements of a maid no one could remember, who walked unlit into the dark at the stroke of 12 and would not be missed if she never came back. There were only so many shapes a thing like that could take. He turned them over as he watched the north door swing shut behind her. Perhaps she was a spy, carrying out of these walls whatever a spy carries. Perhaps she went to meet someone. Or perhaps she was exactly what the gray thread in his wrist suggested she was, and the ease he felt in her presence was only the ease of a man being gentled by the very hand that was killing him, so that he would not struggle while it finished its patient work. That last thought settled in him and would not leave. He had loved this palace once, before the sickness made every room a place he might die in. Now he stood in it like a ghost of himself, and understood, with a cold and total clarity, that he had been letting this happen to him. He had let them prod at his wrist and shake their heads. He had let his council murmur about the succession over his own living body. He had lain in his bed on the good nights and let a stranger's nearness lull him, and he had asked her nothing, followed her nowhere, and because some animal part of him did not want the one comfort left to him examined too closely. That ended tonight. Below, the courtyard was empty again, the frost unmarked, but for a single thread of footprints leading to a door that should have been barred. Wealhtheow pushed himself off the cold stone. His legs took his weight, barely, and far down in his chest, his wolf stirred, curious as it had not been in a long while, as though it too wished to know where the grey maid went when the world was asleep. He would follow her himself. Tonight, with no guard and no witness, he would learn what she carried into the dark. If she was killing him, he would have the truth of it from her own mouth before he died. And if she was not, then he needed to know that far more. He did not reach the north door. He had crossed half the gallery, creeping through his own house like a thief, when a voice spoke from the dark behind him. "You should be in your bed." Wealhtheow did not turn at once. He knew the voice as well as his own pulse. Reuven had stood at his shoulder through 3 border wars and 2 hard winters, and he had a soldier's gift for being exactly where he was least wanted. "I could not sleep," Wealhtheow said. "You do not sleep. That is the whole trouble." Reuven came forward, until the faint light from the high windows found the grey in his beard and the deeper grey of worry beneath his eyes. The council sat again at dusk. "They did not wait for you. Let me guess what they decided." "There is nothing to guess. They want you wed before the thaw. The bride to be Lady Sylvain of House Violend, and the match announced while you can still stand at the altar." Reuven's mouth twisted. "Lord Ferrand has been very tender about your health. He speaks of it in council the way a crow speaks of a dying lamb." The old anger stirred, and some distant part of Wealhtheow was glad of it, for anger at least was warm. House Violend had wanted its blood in the royal line for 3 generations. Now the king was failing. The succession hung open like an unlatched gate, and Ferrand had a marriageable niece and many friends among the lords who counted votes. It did not take a suspicious man to see the shape of it, only a man with a grey thread crawling up his wrist, and the borders, Wealhtheow said, because he could not bear to speak of the marriage. What word from the east? Reuven's silence was its own answer. Then quietly, "The hunts came back empty again. 3rd week running. The deer have gone from the cinderwood, and what game the men find is sick, thin, and wrong in ways they cannot name. The holdfasts are calling it a blight." He paused. "When an alpha weakens, his land weakens with him. Every wolf in Talvain feels it, whether they say so or not. The realm is only ever as well as the king who holds it." "So mend the king," Wealhtheow said lightly, "and mend the realm. If only I knew a healer who could." The words fell between them, and Wealhtheow said nothing, because he was thinking of one. By the time he had turned Reuven aside, with a promise to rest, the great bell had long finished its 12th stroke. When he came at last to the gallery window, the courtyard lay empty and unmarked. She was already gone. The hour had closed around her like water, and beneath his ribs, on cue, the grey ache unsheathed itself and began patiently to dig. He stood a long while, breathing through it. "One thing more," Reuven had said, and it was the thing that stayed. Days before, uneasy, Wealhtheow had set the steward quietly to learn what he could of the grey maid, and the man had come back with nothing at all. No village of birth in the rolls, no kin, no papers of service. She had come to the household gate a year ago, in the autumn, with a dead woman's reference and a face no one could afterward remember hiring, as though she had stepped out of the dark and simply begun to be there. I do not like a servant with no history, my king, Reuven had told him. In my experience they are always someone else's present. Bielric watched the empty frost until the cold drove him in. Tomorrow, he told himself. Tomorrow at the 12th bell. Nothing in this world or any other would stop him. The next night he was ready before the bells. He did not creep this time. He had spent a lifetime moving through country where being seen meant being killed, and though the sickness had stolen his strength, it had not touched that older skill. When the 12th stroke came and the gray cloak slipped from the north door, he was already in the courtyard shadow, and he went after her like a hunter after the last deer in a failing wood. She went not to the stables or the kitchens, but to the north wall, to a postern gate he had half forgotten, its lock hanging open, though he knew it was kept barred. Beyond it the ground fell into the old commons outside the walls, the rough wet land no one farmed, and she crossed it without a lamp and without a stumble, as if her feet had walked the path 100 times in the black. He followed her to the ring of grey stones. They stood at the low bottom of the commons, where the ground always wept, old stones taller than a man, leaning their heads together around a well so ancient no one remembered who had cut it. The country folk called it the Grey Well, and would not come near after dark. Leora went to it the way a woman goes to a task she has done too often to fear. She knelt at the well's stone lip and unwound the cloth from around her hands. And then, out of her own 2 palms, she drew death. Bielric had no better word for it. In the thin starlight, a darkness came up from her hands, black and moving, a living thread of it, and then another and another, as though she were pulling splinters from her own flesh, except that these splinters writhed. She gathered them and gave them to the water where they touched. The well hissed, and a smell rose off it, hot and rotten and wrong, the very smell he had begun to catch on his own breath in the worst hours before dawn. She bowed over the stone, shaking with the cost of it, and even at this distance he could see her hands were seamed with scars, burn upon burn upon burn, the hands of someone who had gripped something searing again and never let go. He knew that darkness. He had watched it leave his own skin on the good mornings, the mornings after she had tended his rooms, a gray thread lifting off his wrist and thinning into nothing while he told himself it was the fever breaking. It had never been the fever, it had been her. She had been reaching into him while he slept, drawing the death out a little at a time, carrying it here in her bare hands, paying for it in her own burned flesh, so that he might wake and believe himself, for a few borrowed hours, a man who could still live. She was not killing him. She was the only reason he was not already dead. The understanding went through him like cold water, and on its heels a second, colder still. Whatever had been set loose in him was not finished. It was still coming, night upon night, faster than one pair of ruined hands could ever carry away. He watched her sway at the well's edge, spent to the bone, and saw the moment her strength failed. She reached for the stone to steady herself, and missed. And the king who had come into the dark to accuse her was moving. Before he knew he had chosen to, out from the shadow of the stones, across the wet and whispering ground, reaching for a falling woman he had crossed a kingdom of his own suspicion to find. Leora heard him. Of course she heard him. She turned, white to the lips, one scarred hand flung up between them, and the look on her face was not that of a spy run to ground or a poisoner unmasked. It was pure terror, the terror of a soul whose one secret in all the world has just come up behind her, wearing the face of the very man she has been ruining herself to save. The Alpha King and his hidden healer stared at each other across the ruined water, and neither could find a word. And high on the black line of the wall above them, a shape that neither one had seen went suddenly still, watched a moment longer, and slipped away quiet as smoke into the night. Neither of them moved for the space of a long breath. The king stood over the fallen woman, with his hand still held out. She stared up with her scarred palm raised between them like a shield, that would stop nothing. The wind combed through the gray stones and said the only words either of them could find. Then Leora scrambled back, her heels slipping on the wet ground, and got herself upright against the well's stone lip, and the first thing out of her was not a plea for her life. "You have to go back inside," she said. "Now, before the cold gets any deeper into you." He had rehearsed a dozen hard questions on the walk out here, the ones a man puts to the servant who is killing him. Everyone left him at once. "You are worried," he said slowly, "about the cold getting into me. You do not understand what has been done to you." Her voice shook, and he understood, with a strange lurch, that it did not shake with fear of him. "Every hour you spend out here in the wet undoes an hour of what I have spent the better part of a year buying you. Please, whatever you think you saw, walk back through that gate, and let me finish, and in the morning you may have me hanged if you still wish it." "I watched you pull something living out of your own two hands." He did not move. "I am not going anywhere until you tell me what it was." For a moment he thought she would run and make him chase her down on legs that could barely carry him. Then something went out of her, and she sagged against the old stone, as though the truth weighed more than she did. "It is not a sickness," she said. "It never was. What is in you was put there, worked into your flesh a thread at a time, by a hand that meant it, and made slow on purpose, slow enough that no healer alive would ever stand over your grave and call it murder. The cold that went through him then had nothing to do with the night. My physicians could find nothing. Your physicians cannot see it, because the craft that made it was burned out of the world a long age ago, and the craft that reads it was burned beside it. I am one of the few left who can." She lifted her ruined hands and looked at them the way a smith looks at his tools. "My kind were called the Virini. We were healers once, who could take a working out of living flesh the way you draw a splinter from a thumb. That was enough to see us hunted to the last handful. What you saw me do at the well, I do every midnight. A working does not vanish when it is pulled free. It must be carried somewhere old and deep, and given to water that can unmake it. I cannot do that inside your walls, where it would fight the stone and spill into the ground and the people." She looked toward the black mouth of the well. "So, I carry the price of it home in my hands." He looked at the scars again and made himself understand what he was seeing. Old burns crossed over older ones. "A long year of them. How long," he said, "have I got?" And there, at last, her steadiness broke. "That is the part I cannot mend," she whispered. "I am losing. Whoever wove this into you relays it quicker than any pair of hands could ever carry away. You are dying slower than they meant you to. But you are still dying, my king, because the hand that made this is close and patient, and it has not once stopped." "How did you come to be here?" he said. "The steward can find no trace of you before you came to us." "Because before I came, I was elsewhere, feeling this. A working of this size rings across the land like a struck bell to anyone left who can hear it. I followed the sound to its source, meaning to find the one making it and stop the making. Instead, I found it wound 7 times around the heart of a sleeping king, far too deep to break." Her mouth twisted. "So I took a gray cloak and a dead woman's name, and stayed. And I have carried you out of your grave a handful at a time ever since, searching every day for the face of the one who put you in it." He should have been afraid of her, a creature out of the oldest fears of his blood, with her hands in his flesh every night of his life. Instead, he felt only that he had walked into the dark to catch a killer, and knelt to the wrong enemy for a whole year, while the one soul in Ondrin who ever lifted a hand to save him did it in secret and paid in her own flesh. "Why?" he said. "You know what my court would do to you. You know the law. Why burn yourself to the bone for a king who would be within his rights to hang you for it?" She was quiet a long moment. "Because I could not feel it killing you and do nothing," she said, and then, lower, as though she had not meant to let it loose, "and because it should not be this easy." The drawing is meant to be like forcing a locked door. With you, it is like a door that swings open before I ever touch it. Your flesh does not fight my hands. I have never known a body that wanted the mending the way yours does, as though some part of you already knew mine and had been waiting for it. She did not say the word, he did not either, but it settled into the cold between them and stayed. You are not my killer, he said. You are the only ally I have in this, and whoever wove this thing walks my halls and eats at my table and calls me his king. I mean to find them, and I will not let you burn for it. She looked at him then, with something close to grief. You do not understand what you have done tonight. A curse like this only holds while the man wearing it believes he is merely sick. The moment they learn you have seen the truth, they will stop being patient. They will kill you fast and plain and call it a broken heart. And no one will go looking for a weaver. Then let them try. They do not know that I know. Leora's gaze went past his shoulder, up to the long black line of the wall above the commons, where a moment before a shape had stood, and where now nothing stood at all. My king, she said softly, I think that they already do. They already know. The words walked beside him all the next day like a second shadow. He could not hide. A king who takes to his bed the morning after he is seen where he had no business being, only tells his enemies that their guest struck home. So Valeric washed the marsh off his skin, put on the heavy gray and silver of his house, and went down to the long hall to hold the audience he could not avoid. Rouvan walked a pace behind him with a hand never far from his hilt, the only man in Ondrin besides a hunted witch who understood what they were truly guarding against. Vielric watched the faces the way Leora had taught him to, without ever teaching him, looking now not for loyalty but for patience, for the single face that could smile at a dying king and feel nothing at all. Lord Ferrant was all warmth. He spoke of the wedding as a settled thing, of Lady Sylvain's gentleness, of how the whole realm would rest easier once the succession was made sure. Vielric gave him nothing and watched his eyes and thought, is it you? Is it you? Is it you? It came on him between one breath and the next. Not the slow ache he had lived inside for a year. This was a flood. It went up his arm and into his chest, like gray water bursting a dam, and the strength poured out of his legs, and the great hall tilted, and the cold floor came up to meet his knees. Someone cried out. A cup shattered on the stone. Down the length of the hall, the lords came to their feet, in a rustle of fur and alarm, and not one of them moved to help him. From very far away, he heard his own name in Rouvan's voice, and then Rouvan's hands were on his shoulders, holding him up as though a man could hold up a tide. He looked down and saw the thread rising through the skin of his wrist. Not one hair now, but a dozen, 100, black and swarming, climbing him faster than anything Leora had ever drawn off in a whole night. They had stopped being patient. They were finishing it here, in the open in front of the entire court, where 100 witnesses would swear on their blood that the king had simply fallen. He could not speak. His physicians closed around him, useless hands laid over useless hands, calling for water, for air, for room, and past them the hall was a smear of pale faces, and somewhere in that smear, pressed back against the far wall among the other servants in her plain gray cloak, was the only person in the room who understood that he had perhaps 200 heartbeats left to live, and that no quiet midnight carry could ever buy them back. He found her eyes across the dying light. He saw her understand. He saw her look once at the side door. She could still slip through. At the long, ordinary life a careful woman could still choose. At the law that would take her head the instant she showed these people what she truly was. And then he saw her push off the wall and start toward him. Afterward, Leora would not be able to say that she had decided anything. There was the wall at her back, and the safe door to her left, and there was the man on the floor, with a year of her secret unraveling all at once inside him, and between those two things, Her body simply chose. The way a hand closes over a falling child before the mind has caught up to the fall. She was already moving. She was already on her knees at his side, shoving a physician's soft, useless fingers out of the way, and she heard someone say, "Who is that? Get the girl back from him," and she paid it, no more mind than she would have paid the wind. She took the king's ruined wrist in both her scarred hands, and she opened the locked door of herself all the way, and she pulled. She had never drawn like this. On the good nights, she took a careful portion, a thread, a single strand, only ever what the well could unmake and her hands could bear to carry. Now there was no time left to be careful, and no well to carry it too, and so she took all of it, the whole black flood of the working, up out of his flesh and into her own, far faster than was safe, faster than was survivable. Because the only vessel in that hall deep enough to hold the king's death was the woman who had spent her whole life learning to carry it. It went into her like swallowing fire. She heard herself make a sound she had never made before. The great thread poured up her arms and under her skin, and she held it, all of it, shaking her whole body, a single clenched fist around a thing that wanted to burn its way out through her heart. Dimly she knew there was light around her hands now, the pale gray glow the old story spoke of, and the hunters had killed a whole people to snuff out. Dimly she knew the hall had gone silent, that 100 wolves of the court were staring at a servant girl lit up like a struck match, doing the forbidden thing in the open, where every eye could see. She did not care. She turned her head and found the great cold hearth at the end of the hall, dead and swept and open to the sky above, the nearest thing to deep old dark within her reach, and she flung the working into it the way she flung it nightly into the well. The fire that was not fire tore out of her and roared up the black flue and was gone. Then there was only a spent woman on her knees beside a king who was breathing. Valric's eyes opened. The gray was gone from his wrist. For the first time in a year, the color of a living man sat warm under his skin, and he looked up at her with a wonder that hurt worse than the burning had, because she knew already what her wonder had just cost the both of them. The hall found its voice all at once. Which? It was an old counselor with a white chain of office across his chest, and he said the word the way a man says it to make it a sentence of death. Vireni in the king's own hall. She had her hands inside him. You all saw it. And she had her hands inside the king. She saved his life. Rouvan was there, sword already half out of its sheath, planted over the two of them. She is the reason his life wanted saving. Lord Ferrand had risen from his place, and his face wore precisely the right measure of horror. And Leora, looking up at him through the wreck of her own strength, felt the last piece of it slide home, with a quiet and terrible click. She had hunted one face in a palace full of them. Month after month she knew, now the particular warmth of a man who has waited a long and careful time to watch you die, and who must not for anything let it show. He was not looking at the king he had just failed to kill. He was looking at her. "Take the witch," said Lord Ferrand, ever so gently, "before she finishes what she has begun. If Leora's midnight secret has pulled you this far into the dark, take one breath here with her before the hall turns." Tap subscribe so the rest of her story finds its way back to you, and if you already know whose hand you would never want at your own table, say the name in the comments. Now back to the Great Hall, where a king who has just been handed his life is deciding what to do with it. The guards came for her before the king could stand. 2 of them, big men in the gray and silver of the household, crossed the hall at Lord Ferrand's word, with their hands already reaching, and Leora, spent to the last coal of herself on the cold floor, could not have lifted a finger to stop them. She did not try. She had always known this was how it ended for her kind. She only turned her head, so that the last thing she saw would be the living color in the face of the man she had bought it for. Then that man stood up. He should not have been able to. A quarter hour ago, he had been dying on his knees in front of the whole court. But Valeric rose off the stone in one motion, the way he must have risen 100 times before the gray thread ever touched him, and the sound the hall made was not a cheer and not a gasp, but something caught between them, the sound of a great many people watching a dead man walk. "Lay one hand on her," he said, "and you will answer to me for it with your own." The guards stopped. They looked from the king to Lord Ferrant and back, and in the space of that, looking, every soul in the hall understood that the ground had shifted under them, and no one yet knew where it would settle. Ferrant's voice was smooth as poured cream. "You are not well. You cannot be well. Not truly. Not so fast. You feel strong, I do not doubt it. But you have just been handled, inside and out, by a creature the law of your own fathers condemns to the fire. Let us take her somewhere. She can do no more of it. She has left me alive." Valeric put himself between Leora and the reaching men, and though he swayed once, he did not fall, and his hand, when it dropped to her shoulder, was warm and steady, which is more than any physician in this hall has managed in a year. "Hear me. I have not been sick. I have been murdered, slowly, by inches, by a working laid into my flesh with intent, and this woman is the only reason I did not go into the ground last winter without ever knowing why. The one you should be seizing is not the healer. It is the hand that made the wound." The hall broke into noise. Leora, at his feet, watched the faces the way she had learned to, and saw belief flicker across some of them, and fear across more, and she watched the old counselor with the white chain go gray in the cheeks, because a court that has spent a year pitying a dying king does not easily swallow that it stood witness to a murder. For one breath, she thought he had done it. She thought the king's plain fury might be enough. Then Lord Ferrant began, very quietly, to smile. "Listen to how he speaks," he said. "Not to the king, but to the lords along the walls," spreading his hands as though his own heart were breaking. A day passed. He could not cross a room. Now he leaps to his feet to shield the Virene witch with her own foul light still cooling on her hands. "My lords, I beg you, this is not a man who has been healed." He let the silence stretch until it was unbearable, and only then gave it the word. "This is a man who has been taken. Look at him. Defend her. Whatever she has put into him, it is not health, it is a leash." And Leora felt the whole room turn, the way a field turns when the wind changes, all the grain leaning at once. That was the trap, and she had walked him straight into it. Every hour Valeric stood strong was proof of dark magic. Every word he spoke in her defense was the witch speaking through him. The more loyal he was, the more surely he damned them both. Ferrant had lost his slow murder and been handed something better. A king who could be deposed not as a corpse, but as a thrall. "Take her to the West Tower," Valeric said, and there was iron under it now, the sound of a man who has felt the floor give way and means to choose where he falls. "Under my guard, not the council's. She will be tried, since you all want a trial so badly, but she will be tried, living and whole, and by me, and any man who touches her before then touches my crown." He looked down the long hall at Ferrant, and for once he said nothing clever at all. He only looked, and let the older man see that he was seen. They got her out under Rouvan's people. 4 blades Valeric trusted with his life, because he had no one else left to trust. And the last thing she heard as the great doors closed was Lord Ferrant telling the lords of Talvan how very much it pained him to say what a loyal man now had to say about his king. They did not take her to a cell. They took her to a small, warm room high in the West Tower, with a barred door and a fire, and it was there, near the middle of the night, that Valeric came to her, alone, which he should not have done. "You should not be here," she said. "Every hour you spend defending me tightens the rope he is making. I know it. Then why?" He crossed the room and sat, not as a king sits, but as a tired man sits, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off the life she had put back into him. Because night after night, a stranger crept into my rooms and took my death into her own hands and asked nothing of me, not thanks, not mercy, not even to be seen. And I mean to spend whatever I have left being a man who was worth it. He turned her scarred hand over in both of his. You said my flesh knew yours, that it opened for you. Do you know why? I have been afraid to know why. So have I. But I am done being afraid of the one true thing in a palace full of lies. She should have pulled away. But she was so tired, and his hand was so warm, and for the first time since she had followed a great wrong sound across the whole of the land, she was not carrying it alone. For a while, the fire ticked and settled, and somewhere far below, in the great house that was quietly deciding whether to keep him or kill him, a door closed, and then another, and the ordinary night sounds of Andrin went on as though nothing in the world had changed, as though a king and a witch were not sitting hand in hand in a locked tower, waiting to learn how many friends they had left. She thought she should be terrified. She had been terrified for a year, every midnight, at every turned corner. Instead she felt, absurdly at rest, the way you feel when a thing you have dreaded for a long time has finally simply happened and turned out to be survivable after all. It will come back, she said softly, because one of them had to. What I drew off you is gone from your body, but it is not broken. He will weave it again and again, and there is no well deep enough, and no hands strong enough to carry it forever. Unless we cut it at the root, you will die, and this time I do not think even I will be there to stop it. Vielric looked into the fire. Then tell me how we cut it, at the root, and tell me what it costs. All of it. No more secrets between us. Healer. Not now. And Leora, who had kept every secret she owned, for the length of her whole hunted life, opened her mouth to tell him the one that would end it. She did not tell him that night. She could not with his hand still warm in hers, and the fire making the small room feel, for one stolen hour, like a place two ordinary people might belong. She told him instead about the world before the burnings, and he told her about the border wars, and somewhere in the low talk of it, the last distance between them wore away, and when at last he kissed her, it felt less like a beginning than like the closing of a circle long left open. That is the why, she whispered when they parted. The reason your flesh opens for my hands. I felt it the first night I ever drew off you, and it frightened me more than the curse did. You are mine. You were made mine before either of us drew breath, and some deep animal part of you has known it since the night I first came into your rooms. A working fights a stranger's hands. It cannot fight the hands of a mate. He was very still. And you carried my death all that long year and never said. What was there to say? That the king of Talvain was fated to a burned Vireni maid, with a dead woman's name. They would have hanged me twice. Her smile broke a little. I did not save you, because you were mine. I saved you because I could not stand in a room and feel a good man dying and turn away. The rest of it only made the standing there easier. They had until dawn, and they spent it talking low in the firelight, saying the things there had never before been time to say. But when the gray light came through the north window, so did the things she had been putting off, and she made herself say it plainly. There is one way to break a working at its root, and only one. It is called a severing. Instead of drawing the curse off by slow inches and carrying it away, I take the whole of it at once, down to the last thread, and instead of giving it to a well, I follow the thread back to the hand that spun it and cut it there. A working severed at the root does not simply die. It recoils. It goes home. Everything the weaver made for you comes back down the line and lands, all at once, on the weaver, on Ferrant, on whoever wove it. Yes. His eyes were sharp now, a soldier seeing the shape of a battle. Then that is what we do. You sever it, it goes back to him, and he takes the death he built for me. Where is the cost you keep hiding? She loved him too much to lie. and not quite enough to make the truth easy. To sever a working this deep, I have to hold the whole of it inside me while I cut. The whole year of it, all at once, where I used to carry only a night. No Virene who ever tried it lived to see the thread land. The carrier burns with the curse. I break it. It kills him, and it kills me a breath behind him. No, Vielric. Listen to me. No, he was on his feet. I did not claw my way back from my own grave to send you into yours. We find another way. We bring the lords. We take Ferent by the law. There is no time for the law, and you know it. She rose and took his face in her ruined hands. He is not waiting for a trial. Every hour he is out there turning your lords, and the moment he has enough of them, he will not need a fire or a reason. The horn cut her off. It came up from the courtyard below, long and low and wrong, a war note in a palace at peace, and it was answered from the gatehouse, and then from the barracks, and Leora felt the floor of the tower shiver with the sound of a great many boots beginning to move at once. Vielric was already at the window. When he turned back, his face had gone to stone. He is not turning them anymore, he said. He has turned them. They are forming up in my own yard. Below, in the cold dawn, House Valen's banners were rising over the household guard, and the coup that had been a whisper for a year had just, all at once, learned how to shout. They did not have the West Tower for long. Revan came up the stair 3 steps at a time, with blood already on his sleeve and 4 men behind him, and he did not waste breath on the king's title. The gate is theirs. Half the guard went over in the night, and the other half is still deciding, and a man who is still deciding is no use to us. Ferent has read a paper to the yard. He says, you are ensorcelled past saving, that the crown passes to a regency until you are yourself again, and that the witch in the tower is to be taken and burned before noon, to break her hold on you. He looked at Leora, and there was an apology in it. They believed the burning part. Men always believe the burning part. The lords, Vielric said. Some for you, more for him, most for whoever is still standing at supper. Reuven thrust a sword into the king's hand. Which had better be us. What followed, Leora would remember afterward only in pieces. The way you remember a fire, the narrow stair and the press of bodies. Reuven's voice, roaring the king's name like a banner to any man who still had ears for it. Vielric fighting down through his own house against his own guard, and the terrible grace of it, a man given his strength back 1 day ago spending it without care, because the woman behind him could not run, and the friend beside him would not. They were trying to reach the old Sally Gate, the one Leora had crept through 100 midnights, because a working of loyal men can be broken, but a single locked door in the dark can still be trusted. Twice the stair turned back on them, and twice Reuven's men bought it back with their bodies, and Leora, pressed to the cold wall between 2 blades who had been ordered to keep her alive at any cost to themselves, watched men she had passed 100 times in the corridors die for a king. Half of them had spent the night calling a puppet. That was the thing the songs never told you, about a house turning on itself. It was not 2 armies. It was one, cut down the middle, every face on both sides. A familiar one, they almost made it. In the lower gallery under the frames of the dead kings, Ferent's people came at them from 2 sides at once, and the little knot of loyal blades broke apart in the crush. Leora felt Reuven shove her hard toward the gate and heard him shout at her to run, and then the tide of it simply took the king away from her. One moment his hand was locked around her wrist. The next, there were bodies between them, a wall of gray and silver, and she was being carried backward, toward the gate by the sheer weight of Reuven's last men, while Vielric was swallowed the other way, cut off, alone, roaring her name over the heads of the men trying to kill him. Vielric. She got one glimpse of him through the churn, still on his feet, still swinging, and then the gray thread. She saw it even at that distance, even in that chaos, because she had come to know the look of it over a long year. It came up out of his sword arm all at once, black and swarming, faster than she had ever seen it move, and she understood with a horror that stopped her heart that Ferrant was not waiting for any fire in any yard. He had begun to weave again the instant the fighting started, pouring the whole year's death back into the king in minutes, and there was no one at Vielric's side to draw it off, because the only pair of hands in the world that could was being dragged backward through a gate she had opened 10,000 times, and would have given anything to have walled shut. For the last thing she saw, before the men pulled her through, was the King of Talvain, going down under the grey, and the last thing she heard was Lord Ferrant's voice, somewhere above the noise, giving the order at last, warm and gentle and glad. Take the witch to the yard. Let her watch him die before she burns. They bound her hands with cold iron, the old way, the way the hunters had always bound a Vairani so she could not work. And they dragged her out into the great courtyard where the whole of it had begun, and they made her kneel in the frost to watch. They had brought him out too. Vielric lay on the stones at the foot of the block, and he was not dead, quite, but the grey had him now the way the tide has a drowning man. It rose past his wrist, past his elbow, black threads climbing his throat, and every breath he dragged in was shallower than the one before. He was too far gone even to lift his head. Around the yard, the lords of Talvain stood in a ragged ring, some ashamed, some triumphant, most only cold and watchful, waiting the way men wait to see which way to jump. Not one of them met her eyes. It is easier to burn a woman you have decided not to look at. And above them all, on the guardhouse steps where every eye could find him, stood Lord Ferrant, with his hands folded like a man at prayer. You could have simply gone, he told her, almost kindly, when they forced her to her knees. A year ago, when you first felt my work and came sniffing after it, you could have turned around and let a king you had never met die quietly of a sickness and lived a long grey life somewhere far from here. Instead, you stayed, and you fought me a whole year in the dark, one handful at a time. He shook his head, and something in his face was almost admiration. Do you know, I never once caught you at it. A year of my finest work, coming undone every night, and I searched every face in this palace, and never thought to look twice at the girl who turned down the beds. I have wanted to know your name for months. He nodded to the men beside the block. It does not matter now. Bring the fire. They brought the fire. She heard the pitch catch and hiss, heard the low, ugly murmur of a crowd that has talked itself into watching something it will be ashamed of by nightfall. A child somewhere among the household folk was crying and being hushed. The pitch smoke bent low across the frost and found her, and she breathed it in and did not look away from the king. She had always thought, when she pictured a morning like this one, that she would spend it praying. She did not pray. She looked at Vielric, and counted his shallow breaths, and waited. And Leora, kneeling in the cold with iron on her wrists, and the man she had burned herself to keep alive dying 20 feet away, stopped being afraid. It is a strange thing, to have nothing left to lose. It is quiet. All her life Leora had carried her fear, the way she carried the grey thread, a little at a time, tucked away where no one could see it. Now, kneeling on the frost, with the torch coming toward her, and the man who was hers drowning in black an arm's length beyond her reach, she simply set it down. There was no well left to reach, no door left to run through, no secret left to keep. There was only the dying king on the stones, and the thread of death climbing his throat, and the cold iron on her own wrists, and the one thing she had spent her whole hunted life being too afraid to do. So she did it. She could not use her hands. That was the thing Ferrant had never understood about the iron, because he was a weaver and not a drawer and did not know the shape of her craft from the inside. The hands were only ever where she gathered it. The drawing itself came from somewhere deeper, from the same buried place the fear had lived, and she reached into that place now, and for the first time in her life, opened it all the way to the bottom. There was so much more of it down there than she had ever let herself touch. All her life, she had drawn the way a careful woman spends the last coins in her purse, only what she must, always keeping something back against the winter. She had kept something back, even from herself. Now she turned the purse out, entire, every coin she had ever been afraid to spend, and found at the very bottom of it, under the fear, and under the caution, and under a long year of grief, a well of strength, so deep and so old that it frightened her more than the dying did. The whole yard felt it. The torchbearer faltered. The murmuring died. A cold wind that had not been there a moment before moved across the frost and set the banners of a doomed house snapping, and every wolf in that courtyard felt the hair rise along its arms without knowing why. Leora sent herself down the length of the stones toward the king, not walking, nothing so small as walking. She poured what she was across the frozen yard and into the dying man, the way she had crept into his rooms 100 midnights, except that there was no more creeping now and no more careful portions. And, when she reached the working wound 7 times around his heart, she did not take a strand of it, or a thread, or a single night's worth. She took all of it. The whole year of murder came up off him at once and into her, and it was worse than fire, worse than anything the old stories had ever thought to warn her of. A black flood poured up a bridge of pale light from the king on the stones to the witch on her knees, and the entire court of Talvain stood frozen and watched a bound woman with iron on her wrists blaze up gray and terrible in the dawn, like the last of a burned people come back for a reckoning. She heard screaming. Some of it was hers. She held the whole of his death inside one small mortal body, every thread of it, and she felt it begin, exactly as the stories had always promised, to kill her. She felt her heart lurch and stutter under the load. She felt the black threads reach for the soft places in her, the way roots reach for water, hunting her lungs, her spine, the warm red engine behind her ribs. A lesser drawer would have flinched, then would have let a little of it slip back to spare herself, and that little would have been enough to fail. Leora did not flinch. She had spent a year practicing exactly this, one careful strand at a time, without ever once letting herself name what she was practicing for. But she did not carry it to a well. This time, she followed it home. A working remembers the hand that made it. Leora had known that since she was a child, and she had spent a year with her fingers deep in Ferran's craft, learning the particular cruel signature of it, the way you come to know a stranger's handwriting from reading his letters over and over in the dark. Now, holding the whole screaming length of it inside her, she reached for that signature and followed the thread back along its own line, off the stones, across the yard, up the guardhouse steps, past the folded praying hands, to the cold, quiet knot at the center of the man where the working still joined its weaver like a cord joins a child to its mother. She had one breath left in her. She spent it there. She gathered the last of everything she had ever been, every burned night, and every carried death, and every mile she had walked alone toward a sound only she could hear, and she brought it down on that knot like an axe. She cut, severing. The word did not do it justice. The thread did not break so much as recoil. The whole year of death, whipping back down its own length all at once, and it went home. It went into Lord Ferrant the way it had gone into her, except that she had spent her life learning to carry such things, and he had spent his learning only how to give them away. He had time to look surprised. That was all. The grey took him standing. It came up his folded hands and his praying arms and his gentle grieving face, faster than it had ever taken the king, because a curse built to kill a strong man slowly over a year does not kill slowly when the whole year of it arrives in a single breath. The lords of Talvain watched the man who had called their king bewitched fall down dead on his own guardhouse steps with his own murder written black beneath his skin, plain as a signed confession for every eye in the yard to read. There was no arguing with it. That was the mercy of the truth when it finally came. 100 witnesses had seen the working leave the king, and they had seen where it chose to go, and a working goes only ever to one place, back to the hand that made it. Every lord in that yard who knew the smallest thing about the old craft understood in a single terrible instant that they had spent a year grieving for a man, Lord Farrant of House Vayland, had been quietly killing the entire time, and that they had very nearly cheered him onto the throne for the doing of it. A woman near the front of the ring began, quietly, to weep. A captain of the guard, who had gone over to Vayland in the dark, went down on one knee in the frost and stayed there, staring at the dead man on the steps, as though by kneeling soon enough he might unmake the hour in which he had chosen wrong. But Leora did not see them understand. She had already fallen. The cutting had taken the last of her, exactly as she had always feared it would. She felt herself go down onto the frost. She felt the gray light gutter out of her hands. She felt the enormous quiet of a body that has finally set down everything it was carrying and has nothing left with which to lift itself back up. It did not hurt anymore, and that frightened her, distantly, the way a thing frightens you when you are already too far off to do anything about it. She had broken it. He would live. The thread was cut, and the weaver was dead, and the king of Telvain would rise from these stones a whole man, and she would not be there to see it, and that was a fair trade. She had always known it would be a fair trade. She let her eyes begin to close on the cold, bright morning. Then a warmth caught her hands. His hands, on either side of her face, and his voice, cracked and wild and nothing at all like a king's, calling her back from a doorway she was already halfway through. She wanted to tell him it was all right, that she had known the cost when she paid it and would pay it again. But she had no breath left to spend, and the dark was coming up gently over the edges of everything, and she could not even lift her ruined hand to his. "No," Beelric was saying, over and over. "No, you do not get to do this. You do not get to carry me for a year, and then leave the very moment I could carry you back. Look at me. Leora, you said my flesh opened for yours. You said a working could not fight the hands of a mate." And through the closing dark, she felt him understand it. In the same breath, she did. The bond ran both ways. She had poured herself into him for a year, and she had never once, in all that time, let it come back the other way, because she had come to give and not to take, and because a hunted woman never learns how to be carried. But the door that opened for her hands had always opened both ways. And now the man she had died to save reached through it, and took the strength she had just spent her life to give him, and turned it around, and poured it back into her, down the same bright bridge, mate to mate, a whole stolen year of life flooding back across the place where the curse had been cut away. And, because the door was open all the way, now, for the first time and the only time, it did not carry only life, it carried everything. In the space of a few roaring heartbeats, she felt his year the way he had lived it from the inside. The mornings his wolf would not answer. The counsels held over his living body, the particular loneliness of a strong man teaching himself to die politely so as not to frighten his people. And she felt him feel hers, in the same instant, the burnings and the walking, and the long hunt after a sound no one else could hear. Every midnight she had knelt at the cold well and paid for his sleep in her own skin, and slipped back through the gate before dawn. There were no secrets left after that. There is no room in a shared heartbeat for secrets. They came out the far side of it, knowing each other the way the fated are meant to, and almost never live long enough to. Down to the floor, down to the root, nothing hidden and nothing owed. She had held his death, and it had nearly killed her. Now he held her dying, and he simply would not let go of it. It was not gentle. Nothing true ever is. She felt her own heart drag itself back over the threshold beat by unwilling beat, hauled by a will that had already refused one grave that morning and did not see why it should permit another. The gray light came back into her hands, paler now and steadier, and it was not only hers anymore. Somewhere underneath it she could feel him, the second heartbeat that had always quieted at her nearness, no longer a stranger's and no longer a secret, laid down alongside her own and beating from that morning on, for the two of them at once. When Leora opened her eyes, the king of Talvain was bent over her with tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on his face. Alive, whole, strong, and hers. Behind him, the sky over the eastern wall had gone the particular deep gold of a winter dawn. That means the long cold is finally breaking. There, he said, when he saw her looking. His voice would not hold steady, and he did not seem to care who heard it fail. There you are, I told you. No more secrets, and no more leaving, not without me. She tried to answer him, and found her voice came back rough and small, a thread of what it had been. You carried me, she said, as though it were the most impossible thing she had ever heard of, because to her it was. I know, he said. I know. Now you know how it feels. Do not make a habit of frightening me into it. And under the wreck of the morning, kneeling on the cold stones of his own courtyard, the king of Talvain laughed once, wet and helpless, and wholly alive. Around them. Slowly the great yard was going to its knees, not to a dead man's regency, cooling on its steps. To the king who had died in front of them and risen, and to the burned woman in iron who had shown a whole court, in the plainest language there is, exactly whose hand had been at their king's throat the entire time. Reuven was there, bleeding and grinning like a fool, prizing the cold iron off her wrists and swearing at it for taking so long. Somewhere, a bell began to ring, not the deep 12th bell of midnight, but the high, bright peal. The palace kept for coronations and for the ends of wars, and it went out over the waking city like the first clean sound after a long fever. And all along the great gray wall, the wrongness that had been creeping through the ivy and the mortar for a year, the blight no one had wanted to name, was thinning in the new light like frost giving way, as though the whole of Talvain had been holding one long breath and had finally let it go. Afterward, there were a great many things that had to be untangled, and most of them were dull, which is how you know a war is truly over. The lords who had knelt to Ferrant knelt lower to the king, and Vaelric, who had learned a great deal that year about who is worth trusting, let them, and watched them, and forgot nothing. House Fyland was broken, and its lands parcelled out among the holdfasts that had suffered most under the blight, and Lady Sylvain, who had wanted the marriage even less than the king had, was sent quietly to a house by the sea and was by every account more relieved than grieved to go. The old counsellor, with the white chain, laid it down and went home to the country and was not asked to come back. And the grey sickness, the blight that had thinned the herds and killed the cinderwood and hollowed out the hunts, lifted from the land over a single green season. The eastern woods came back so thick and so fast that the holdfasts called it the second spring, and lit fires and gave thanks for it, and never quite knew how right they were, or that the whole of it had turned on one burned pair of hands. They did not hang the Virene maid with the dead woman's name. It is difficult to hang the woman 100 lords watched save the kingdom, and more difficult still when the king has made it plain that any rope meant for her will have to be measured for him first. The old law against her kind was not struck down all at once, because laws written in fear die slowly, but it began to die that year, and Leora lived to see the beginning of it, which was more than any of her people had done in a very long time. She never wore the grey cloak again. But she kept always the habit of the scarred hands, and on the coldest nights of winter, when the old ache of the drawing crept back into them, the king of Talvain would take them both in his and hold them until the ache went quiet, because he had learned that a burden set down beside someone weighs less than half of what it weighs alone. And sometimes late, when the palace of Andren had banked its fires and drowned its long halls in the dark, the two of them would stand together at the north window and look out over the wall toward the ring of grey stones, where a quiet maid had once walked alone into the cold at the stroke of every midnight, Dot carrying a king's death in her bare hands so that he might wake and never know it. He knew it now. That was the whole of the difference, and it was everything. The maid did not leave any more. And the king, who had once stood in the dark and watched her go, never again had to wonder where she went, because at the stroke of the 12th bell, she was exactly where the fated are always, in the end trying to get back to. She was beside him. Thank you for staying to the very end of Lyra's story. If it moved you, even a little, do one small thing before you go. Subscribe, so the next tale finds you the way she found him. Leave a comment and tell me the moment that caught your heart. And share this with someone who believes, as I do, that the quietest soul in the room is very often the one holding the whole of it up. Your next story is already waiting. I will see you there.